The MirYam Institute podcast with Benjamin Anthony. Israel's future in Israel's hands.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We've got a very esteemed panel here with us. Before I get to all of those, I want to begin, as ever I do, by expressing sincere thanks to Rosita Panini, co-founder of the MirYam Institute. Thank you, Rosita, for all that you do. And also to Alan Langer, our colleague in common. Thank you, Alan, for coordinating all of the various speakers, dialing in from several different countries here this evening. The subject is a heady one, and it's a heavy one. And so I'm going to skip the introductions. We're going to talk for about 75 to 90 minutes total. I will say from the top that we're very grateful, particularly to Professor Chuck Freilich for joining us for the first hour of this conversation. I know you have pressing matters beyond that hour. Thank you very much indeed for granting us your analysis here. And with all of that in mind, I'm going to come straight to it. I'd like to begin, Professor Freilich, former Deputy National Security Advisor in the State of Israel, with you, and ask you the following. Much has been made of Israel's security considerations regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine, particularly as it impacts upon Israel's diplomatic response. Now, for the diplomatic assessment, I'm going to lean more heavily on Ambassador Arthur Koll, who's on this webinar, former Deputy Director General of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But I would like to ask you the following. Can you please lay out for our audience in clear and concise terms what the unique security considerations are, such as they may or may not be, with which the State of Israel must conjure at this time, beginning with Russia's presence in Syria and the deconfliction arrangements that exist between the Israeli Air Force and Russian forces inside Syria? If you could give us an overview of that, that would help to provide great context.
Okay, sure, Benjamin. Thanks for having me tonight, and thanks, of course, to Rosita for our ongoing relationship, and to Alan for putting this together. Look, I think this is certainly one of the more critical events that we've all faced for a very long time. Before I answer your question, I just want to put it in a sentence or two in the broader context. I think what we are talking about here is a challenge to the fundamental world order, at least in the post-Cold War era, and in many ways in the post-World War II era. And the stakes here are enormous for the international community. They are enormous for us. There is a challenge to fundamental principles as a result of which this is a challenge to the basic power structure that has been there, to the leadership of the United States and the West, and an evolving axis between Russia and China. Now, we are in the middle of this. It may sound a little bit strange to some people to hear it, but it's as if we have a direct border with Russia. Now, of course, we don't physically have one in the geographic sense, but Russia is deployed in Syria. It has its own air and naval bases there. It has deployed S-300 anti-aircraft systems in the Syrian army, which they still control, and their own S-400 systems, which are the most advanced air defense systems in the world. They cover not just Israel's northern front, not just the Golan Heights region, but pretty much all of the state of Israel. If Russia wishes, they can shut down the Israeli Air Force, or at least greatly constrain its operations. So that in itself is already a huge consideration for the state of Israel. Add to the fact that our real problem isn't Russia. As a matter of fact, Russia partly plays a constructive role in Syria. They do somewhat moderate what's happening there. The real problem, of course, is that Iran is trying to set up its own military presence in Syria, air, naval, and ground bases. They have not large numbers of their own forces there, but they have very large numbers of Shiite militias. And they are trying to do in Syria basically what they did in Lebanon, which is to set up Hezbollah there in a big way hollow out the Syrian regime, the Syrian military, and let Hezbollah become the dominant player there. Now, in Lebanon, Hezbollah has an arsenal somewhere up to 150,000 rockets aimed at the state of Israel. And what they're trying to do is copy that in Syria. Well, so far since the war broke out in Ukraine, a few hundred, I don't know the precise moment, number at the moment, the last I saw was up to 400 missiles had been fired at Ukraine. In the next round with Hezbollah, and this is assuming it's still just Hezbollah in Lebanon, we're talking about 2,000 rockets a day being fired at the state of Israel. So let me put it in that perspective. And of course, there are lots of other issues here. There's the Iranian nuclear negotiations underway and other issues that are of critical importance for Israel's security.
So I said that I was going to come to you, Ambassador Koll, as a former Deputy Director General of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Professor Freilich has outlined some of Israel's unique considerations from a security perspective, but what are the private and public diplomatic happenings emanating from the State of Israel, particularly from our Foreign Ministry and from our Prime Minister, as a consequence of the considerations that Professor Freilich has just pointed out to us? And how would you grade, for want of a better phrase, Israel's diplomatic positioning at this time? There are some who say that it has not been sufficiently outspoken. Others say that they well understand the complexities at play, including a Jewish diaspora within Russia. What are your thoughts on Israel's diplomatic response thus far?
I think that Israeli government, foreign ministry, prime minister, and the diplomats are doing what they can do at the moment, which is a very delicate dance. Because on the one hand, as Professor Freilich explained very clearly, the fact that Russia borders with us and can shut down not only our military air activity, but if it so wants, also air traffic altogether from the one, basically the one international airport that we have in the near Tel Aviv, and that is something that is a reality. In addition to that, we have the Iran negotiations. The United States, of course, is a very important factor, but Russia is a factor there as well. And the new tension must have an effect on those negotiations. And there are those who say that the tension will speed up the signing of an agreement because the West is in dire need of the additional oil that it can get from Iran if it is now signing the agreement and opens up, the world is opening up to Iranian increased oil export. And there are those who say that maybe it will delay the signing. In any case, this is the Iran factor is something that Israel has to take very seriously into account as well. Now, when it comes to the Western position, and Israel clearly is positioned morally, strategically in the West camp. About that, there should be no argument. But on the other hand, those considerations which were described earlier put us in an awkward situation, which forces Israeli leaders to try and speak as little as possible on this matter. In the General Assembly, of course, Israel is going to vote with the United States, condemning the invasion of Ukraine. But there were all kinds of calls for military assistance, even non-fighting military equipment to be passed to the Ukraine. That is something that Israel is not willing to do at this time, because the message to the Russians is not something that we want to send. So where do we stand? Morally, the public opinion in Israel is very much in favor of the Ukrainians. There are Israeli journalists covering from the field, and you can sense both from their reporting and from the media and in general the sympathy of Israel to the Ukrainian people. But if one asks me, will we take a stronger position on this matter? Not at this time, but I have to say not at this time, because I think, maybe we would like to elaborate about it later. We are now talking less than a week from the start of the events, and we don't know when they will end and how they will end. And so we are talking right now very, very short term from diplomatic, military, and historic perspectives. Let's see how things develop, because in the longer run, parties, including Israel, may be forced to take a stronger position.
So thank you. Before I come to you, Ambassador Cameron Munter, about the negotiations that just took place just inside the country of Belarus, I'd like to turn to you, Colonel Collins, because in an article that you recently published for the MirYam Institute, you wrote that Vladimir Putin was acutely aware that sanctions, emphasis on sanctions, against Russia following the seizure of Crimea in 2014 were estimated to have cost approximately $50 billion per year. Now, you go on to say that with President Joe Biden signaling, this is prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with President Joe Biden signaling to Russia that it would pay a heavy price for any invasion, Putin knows that sanctions would be swift and severe if it were to invade. Colonel Collins, my question for you is it precisely the fact that Putin feared only sanctions, perhaps not the scale of the sanctions, but only sanctions nonetheless, and little more beyond that? Is it that fact that has enabled him to engage in this brutal military invasion? That's one question. Second question, is there a scenario in which we could see military engagement between the United States and Russian forces, as commentators and analysts speak about a reordering of the current world order? And my final question, given your background in US Special Forces, are US military assets, including perhaps force multiplying forces and assets, active in Ukraine at this time? And if not, do you expect them to be?
All right, thanks, Benjamin. I'll try to answer each of those. So if I forget one of them, just circle back with me. Yeah, I mean, so the President Biden administration said Russia would pay a heavy price. And it doesn't seem, obviously, with the invasion, that Putin necessarily believed that. And it's probably not a surprise why he wouldn't believe that. I mean, the sanctions really weren't that significant following 2014 seizure of Crimea and continued occupation in the Donbass, or actively supporting separatists there. I mean, all you have to do is look, I mean, historically, right? Russia is awarded the Sochi Olympics in 2007 by the International Olympic Committee, invaded Georgia, and still was able to host the Olympics in Sochi, didn't get them revoked. Here we are 6 years later, 8 years after the seizure of Crimea and occupation in the Donbass, and they still had multiple world championships that they were going to host this coming year. Now, most of them have been revoked in the last 24 to 48 hours, but historically, it just hasn't panned out, right? The West hasn't been able to be unified in these sanctions, so they haven't hurt them significantly. So I think he calculated that wouldn't be the case this time. And I think it was a miscalculation. And I thought they might be swift and severe. I think, I guess I understand diplomacy takes time, but given that Putin had weeks and months of telegraphing this invasion, I thought on the diplomatic side, it would be a quicker response, but it actually, it has been fairly quick when you consider previous things and trying to get so many nations to agree. So as one analyst described it, within the first 48 hours, the sanctions were the equivalent of bringing a pea shooter to a gunfight. They were pretty mediocre, right? It was targeting Putin and I think his foreign minister, very select individuals, not going to have a significant impact. There's been talk of removing Russia from the SWIFT global banking system. Ultimately, that wasn't done, but pulling two key banks from that system overnight had the ruble fall by 30% against the dollar, and the Russian National Bank more than doubling their key interest rate from 9.5% to 20%. So some of those, they are getting to be more severe and fairly swift in where it's come from at this point. So there has been progress on that, but obviously it wasn't enough to deter him. Otherwise, he would be in there. And again, the deterrence hasn't worked because in previous, the sanctions haven't been severe enough and they haven't been enduring enough. So that, to address the sanctions there. And in terms of your question, in terms of military engagement between the US and Russia directly, right, that would change, that we've never seen that happen since in the Cold War, right, with nuclear armed nations engaging forces directly, right? It's always been proxy fights supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, right? Working through that method. That's always been the way in the past throughout the Cold War and post-Cold War era. I just don't see how a scenario where you're going to have direct engagement between US and Russian forces in Ukraine, right? I mean, you might see there were cases in Syria where maybe some proxies having some engagement, but I just don't see that happening. The US is not going to commit forces there, as Biden has repeatedly said, in terms of low-level support or whether it's special operations or someone else in Ukraine. Again, I just don't see that happening, right? In this way, right? To date, it's providing them with weaponry, critical weapons, those kind of things, but I don't see actual US forces on the ground in that kind of a role. We have been training or assisting with training out Ukrainian forces since about 2016. And that's been an effort by US, United Kingdom, Canada, and Lithuania have been the primary partners, but there have been others as well. But yeah, active support on the ground by forces, I just don't see that happening.
So Ambassador Munter, thank you for waiting patiently as we come to you. You're a former director for Central, Eastern, Northern Europe at the National Security Council. And I would like to ask you to weigh in out of the following context. As of today, negotiations have failed to produce a resolution or a ceasefire. A senior Ukrainian advisor to President Zelensky described the ceasefire talks or the negotiations as, well, in a flourish of understatement, as difficult. The Kremlin, meanwhile, has outlined its demands for a ceasefire, those being A, Ukraine's recognition of the 2014 annexation of Crimea, B, Ukraine's ongoing neutrality, and C, this dreadful phrase, demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. And meanwhile, following those negotiations, Ambassador, a convoy of Russian armaments, approximately 40 miles long, continues to move ever closer to the capital, Kiev. And the eastern city of Kharkiv has been massively pummeled again, including as we speak here this evening. So my question to you is, what are some of the main points that can be negotiated at this time? Can these negotiations possibly bear any fruit whatsoever? And how can they be permitted really to go ahead in this manner when effectively Ukraine is being asked to negotiate with a gun pointed squarely against its temple?
Well, thank you so much. And these are difficult questions. Let me first comment that I agree with Artur on a key issue. We are very early in the fight. And I think that all of the things that we see, if we claim that they're true today, they may be, but I'm not sure they'll be true tomorrow. I think the situation on the ground, the events that take place are going to define this in ways we really don't know. So just huge boulder of salt of anything that we predict at this point. Secondly, I think there was a sense where you were asking of the Colonel, how do we get inside Putin's head? I don't think we get inside Putin's head. And I think there's a lot of being written about what will he think, what will make him do this, what will make him do that. I don't think that's fruitful. And I think the most useful piece was an interview held with Fiona Hill, the woman who has studied Putin, worked in the National Security Council until recently, who said, as far as she's concerned, he will do what he needs. There is a strategic vision behind him. You can call it a strategic fantasy, which is the renewal of respect for Russia, and he will do what he needs to do. And so that it's very difficult to think that even if one were to agree with him that he would stop short of this. Specifically on the question of the discussions that have taken place near Gomel in the last couple of days and theoretically could take place again, they've been described to me by people I've been in touch with as not serious. The people who were sent from Russia, for example, the head of delegation was a junior cultural ministry person that is not one of the people intimate with Putin, who's known for basically public diplomacy, ridiculing Ukraine. This was not a serious head of delegation. So, and indeed, the kind of things that they're asking for are things that are, imagine Zelensky were to say, okay, he can not only not, he doesn't believe in them, he can't make them stick. There's nothing there in the Russian proposals that could lead to any kind of coherent outcome. In my opinion, they're not serious proposals. I think that Zelensky wants to talk about peace because I think he doesn't want to be labeled the person who doesn't want peace. And genuinely, I know he's, as you say, he's got a gun to his head. But I think that the anticipation, in anticipation of the battles, there was never any doubt. And again, here I am trying to say what's in Putin's mind. I don't mean to say that, but the Russian plan does not seem to have been to send a number of troops this far into Ukraine in order to stop and make a deal. They are, from all intents and purposes, it just looks they are going to do to Kiev what they did to Grozny. And they are going to, those of you who live much closer to Syria know what they did to Aleppo. It seems quite clear that they plan to step up what they do. And the only question is whether they will be surprised by the savageness of the Ukrainian response, and whether the supplies that come from the West will make a difference. This is the immediate question, and none of us know how this is going to work, whether this is going to be a bloodbath, whether this is going to be a walkover, etc. What's interesting is then when you look a little bit further down the road diplomatically, and you look at, for example, the biggest surprise for most people, that is the turnaround that the Germans have made. This is going to be a real difference, both in the supply of materiel, but also in any post-war settlement that comes in. You have a much more radicalized European public and leadership that is going to find it. You don't have too many more Russlandversteher left in Germany, at least not speaking. That is, if the point of war is to come to a point where you're coming to a political settlement, this has become very, very difficult now for the Russians. One last comment about diplomacy is that it's been, of course, noticed that countries like Israel and India, who are in many ways seen as linchpins of American friendship abroad, have been reticent. What I have been impressed by Tony Blinken is that Tony Blinken has not made a big deal about this. That is, the American administration has not called the Israelis on the carpet saying, why didn't you sell Iron Dome to the Ukrainians? Why aren't you standing up and fight? I don't think the Americans are going to. I think the Americans realize exactly the kind of constraints that Israel faces that other people don't. And in the long run, the investment they, whether rightly or wrongly, want to make with India or even the United Arab Emirates, which, as you know, both India and the UAE abstained in the UN Security Council resolution. They're going to give them some slack, because I think, I hope, I have not spent a lot of time talking to Tony Blinken in the last 8 days, but I think that the Americans do understand that this is a more subtle kind of question. And even though they've lined up, in my opinion, a fairly impressive diplomatic effort to try to get multilateral institutions in Europe, and the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians, even the Singaporeans, to line up with them, they are going to be patient with their friends in Israel, and they're going to be patient with their friends in the UAE and in India. How this plays out in the long run, that's going to be a different question. If things change and become more difficult, more panicky, more tricky, if there are things like tech boycotts, if there are things that are economic, long-term kinds of questions where Israel does have to make a stand, the Americans may turn the screws to Israel. That has not happened yet, and I think the Americans hope it won't happen yet.
Thank you, Ambassador. Professor Freilich, I'm going to come to you right after I bounce an idea of Colonel Collins with regard to the nuclear issue. And actually, it rolls well off Ambassador Munter's comments about Antony Blinken. Yesterday, White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki stated that the US would not be implementing a no-fly zone to ban Russian aircraft from the skies above Ukraine, as it would, and I'm quoting her, essentially mean the US military would be shooting down planes, Russian planes. Britain's Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab again rejected calls for NATO to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine, saying it would risk widening the war by putting the alliance again in direct conflict with Russian forces. Colonel Collins, you've spoken about the utter inconceivability of direct US engagement with Russia. Is it not correct that all of that simply comes down to the fact that Putin holds and has alluded to using the ultimate deterrent, that of nuclear weapons? Is it not really our role beyond sanctions, and I say this channeling others, it's not my opinion, to sort of sit back and watch, because our hands are somewhat tied given his possession of nuclear weapons?
No, I don't think it has anything to do with his announcement. I mean, this was a policy that we had prior to him making the announcement. I mean, President Biden said that we weren't going to put ground forces in there. NATO forces would not go in. Yes, we have forces that we moved into NATO countries in case the conflict did expand beyond Ukraine, but those are by no means ever meant to go into Ukraine. And again, this has been consistent from multiple administrations dating back to the Cold War. That I mean, the idea, right, of a no-fly zone sounds good in theory until you're looking at who would be enforcing it, and it would basically be those NATO nations enforcing it, and therefore that's really consistent with the policy of not direct engagement with a nuclear armed nation.
So, Professor Freilich, I'd like you to handle two questions, if you would. This past Sunday, we heard that Putin ordered Russian nuclear deterrent forces to be placed on alert. Question number one, can you please tell us exactly what that process means in practical terms? There's a lot of panic and some hysteria the moment that phrase nuclear weapons is spoken, understandably so. And the second question that I have for you is whether or not, if the United States is unwilling to engage Putin due to his possession of nuclear weapons, what are the implications of that for the state of Israel in the event that Iran obtains nuclear weapons in the coming months or years?
Well, let me focus primarily on your second question, because I'm not an expert in Russia's, the process that takes place when they declare a nuclear alert. I tend to think that in this case, we're talking more of a declaratory move. And I'm sure something happened with Russia's nuclear forces. The lights were left on longer. I don't think the Russians want a nuclear crisis here any more than anybody else does. This was posturing, this is deterring, this is making sure that the US and NATO stay out militarily, and that the Western response is one of diplomacy and sanctions. Now, there is here another example of what happens when you're dealing with a nuclear armed state. In this case, it's Russia. No big surprise. Nobody wants to take on Russia. And so the Western response has been limited to diplomacy and sanctions. The same thing was true, of course, with North Korea. For years, the North Koreans thumbed their nose at the United States, provoked the US. They were careful enough not to go too far until they crossed the nuclear threshold. today have a small nuclear arsenal, but it's sufficient. Really, the first bomb pretty much is sufficient to give a country, to provide a country with impunity. So here you have the United States, a global superpower, the greatest military power in history, which doesn't really want to mess too much with this militarily, other than the nuclear side, totally inferior adversary. And so today the North Koreans can basically thumb their nose at the US and get away with what they want to. So for us, this is another lesson why we cannot allow Iran to cross the nuclear threshold. Because if they do that, even assuming that they also don't want to use nuclear weapons, because I think they know what the response to that would be, but it would allow Iran to behave in an aggressive fashion in the region generally. It would affect every future regional conflict. And of course, for Israel itself, it would have a major impact. Would we be able to do all sorts of things that we do today in a situation in which Iran was nuclear? For example, if Iran was nuclear today, would Israel be launching these attacks in Syria to prevent them from building their military presence there? If there's a conflict, or if and when there's a conflict,
I think Professor Freilich's frozen, so we'll carry on until he comes back. I would like to ask, can everybody else hear me? Ambassador Koll, can you hear me clearly?
Absolutely.
We can hear you. He's a frozen conflict, I guess. Yeah.
There you go. I know, unfortunately. He's back. Professor Freilich, please continue.
Okay, where did it freeze?
What would Israel do, including in Syria, in the event that Iran had nuclear weapons?
Okay, so the question is whether we would allow ourselves to act there with the freedom that we do today, or in fact at all. Because even if you assume that Iran would probably not use nuclear weapons, overwhelming likelihood that they wouldn't use nuclear weapons, the fact that there is any doubt is a game changer. Because now you risk escalating to the nuclear level, to the existential level. And as we see from American behavior, whether it's vis-a-vis the Russian superpower or a small nuclear power such as North Korea, it changes the game fundamentally. If I could add one last comment, which is not directly related to your question, but to take off from some of the earlier comments about the sanctions. The US decided, I believe correctly decided, that it was not about to go to war over Ukraine, and so it wasn't sending forces to the Ukraine itself. Once you've made that decision, then the American response was inherently limited to diplomacy and to sanctions. Sanctions are a good way of punishing other countries. They have not proven themselves in pretty much all cases as an effective means of changing other nations' behavior. North Korea and Cuba have been under comprehensive sanctions since the 1950s. Okay, Iran, to bring things closer to home to us, Iran was under severe first of all, American sanctions from 1996 on, but then international sanctions from 2012. It was enough to get them to come to the table and negotiate the JCPOA. It wasn't enough to get them to negotiate away the nuclear capability or to forgo it. The maximum pressure campaign under President Trump, which was actually only in effect for less than 2 years, so we don't really know what its ultimate effect might have been. But it too, in that limited amount of time, it caused Iran a great deal of pain. But the objective here in the Iranian case, in the Russian case, it's not to cause the other side pain, it's to get them to change policy. Sanctions have not proven themselves to be an effective means of doing that.
Thank you, Professor Freilich. Colonel Collins, you're going to be up in just a moment with regards to the nature of the fighting forces that we're seeing take form over there in Ukraine. But before we do, I'd like to ask Ambassador Munter in short form and Ambassador Koll in short form. Come back on Professor Freilich's comments. Given the fact that having nuclear weapons has somewhat tied America's ability to confront Russia. In the event that Iran gains nuclear weapons, should we discern from what's taking place today that US security guarantees, which I must say are very much viewed askance already, should be viewed with even greater skepticism in the future? Here in the region, when I say they're viewed askance. Ambassador Munter first briefly, and then Ambassador Koll briefly.
Very good question, and none of us know this, but there's a general sense that I have from my contacts and my experience in Washington that Israel is seen as the equivalent of a NATO ally. That is, Israel has from the United States what is considered an Article 5 guarantee. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that if Iran gets nuclear capability, that is an Article 5 that invokes an Article 5 status? We don't know that.
Article 5 effectively being that which says that
an attack on one is an attack on all. That is to say, Putin, to be crude about it, Putin can massacre Ukraine, but if Putin touches one Polish soldier, we go to war with Putin, right? And I have no doubt that that Article 5 guarantee for Estonia, for Poland, for Romania is true. I think we mean it. But I think the question is, even though, and I'm curious, maybe the Colonel knows this perhaps better than I think we have a kind of an attitude like that for Israel, but does Iran becoming nuclear signify an Article 5 crisis? That is, do we go to war with Iran? Knowing that Iran as a nascent nuclear power is not somebody with 6,000 nuclear missiles, but someone who you would, in concert with Israel, actually attack to prevent them from becoming a nuclear power. I think this is something the Americans discuss, but to your point, when you say look askance, I don't think it's a sure thing.
Thank you. Ambassador Koll, do you agree with the idea that Israel enjoys Article 5 status despite not being a member of NATO? If we are attacked, we have American backing. Are American security guarantees to be viewed even more skeptically now, given the fact that they can't seem to deter Vladimir Putin? And then Colonel Collins, I'll be right with you.
Yes. I think that Ambassador Munter is right about how America views Israel and the ties and the commitment towards Israel from the United States. But I have to say that when it comes to NATO, NATO has many members, and Article 5 is activated, and we are not part of it, only through agreement. And let's remember that there are many different countries who are members of NATO, including Turkey.
Arthur, if I could just interrupt, I didn't mean to imply that NATO felt that same.
Yes. Okay, from the US point of view. No, I think that the US commitment is formidable and lasting. I think it merits some other discussion at another time to discuss the issue of whether Israel and the United States should sign an official defense treaty, mutual defense treaty. It is a matter which has been discussed inside the rooms and comes up from time to time. There are those who are not in favor of such a treaty because treaties do not only bind, have commitments one towards the other, but it also has its limitations, the limitations that can come with them. But I'm sure that the possible nuclearization of Iran will always bring up once again the question of whether Israel and the United States should move one step further on a defense treaty. I do not want to think of Iran as a nuclear state. I think it is a dramatic change in our region. A lot has been said and can be said about it, and unfortunately, the agreement that seems to be in the cooking and maybe signed soon is contrary to what was promised to Israel by this U.S. administration, that it will be extended and strengthened. And it wasn't extended. It will be just a continuum for another 2 or 3 years of the old agreement without any extension, and maybe even weakened. So that is a problem that is, even if it's signed, will have to be dealt with, not only by Israel, but the international community, to make sure that immediately a new agreement will be discussed. That is something that should be on the table, but with the huge crisis in Ukraine and East and West reshaping of world order, Iran may benefit from the lack of attention given to their games in the region, and that would be very sad.
So, Colonel Collins, we're seeing now the return of Ukrainian nationals who were living abroad beyond the boundaries of Ukraine to Ukraine in order to join the fight, to get into the fight for their home. That's a potent call to arms. And in many cases, these are individuals who have never trained militarily, they've never fought, and oftentimes never fired a gun other than on a firing range, it seems. But more than 18,000 rifles have been handed out by the Ukrainian government to these volunteer forces. In addition, the president expressed that criminals, convicts, individuals who are imprisoned could be released and effectively work off their remaining time by joining the fight. He seems to be pulling on every string, grasping at every lever within his grasp in order to defend Ukraine. Tell us, what are the capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces? What are the capabilities of the Ukrainian militia or territorial force? I struggle to find a term. Feel free to provide one if you have one. What are the strengths and capabilities of these forces that are forming? And what does it mean for the potential duration of this fight? I also want to come to you, Professor Freilich, in a moment on another matter. But Colonel Collins, tell us about that. And also, if you can put it in the context of Russian capabilities, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, so in 2014, when Russia seized Crimea and actively supported separatists in Ukraine's east, Ukraine's military was in this dilapidated state, as some called it, and a sorry state, as some called it, right? Hollowed out from years of corruption, as some have described it. And it was really an incapable force. But at that time, massive numbers of volunteers flocked to the front in both a combat and non-combat capability, and really, put it to the separatists and forced Russia to actually send, larger formations across the border. And so you have this history of volunteers, something that kind of the West, we don't have something like that in the same way they did. I mean, it took me going over there and studying it to really understand what this was, because I just really couldn't fathom an entire volunteer battalion out there fighting. And in this case, oftentimes they weren't even given arms from the Ukrainian army. It was just bringing their own arms, their own armor to the fight. So they have a history of this. And after a review of their defense establishment over the next 2 years, in 2016, President Poroshenko enacted by a presidential decree the Strategic Defense Bulletin. And basically what this was a massive reform of the defense establishment to fix some of its shortcoming, make it more Western, more NATO interoperable, but really reforming command and control, the operational employment of the force, logistics, medical support, right? Professionalizing the force, a massive overhaul, right? Set a 2-year goal, wanted this done by 2018. Obviously, they weren't going to get all those things completed, but really reform that. So that's a key piece of why they're so effective right now, is that reform. A second piece is all the experienced fighters, right, in fighting in Donbass over the last 8 years. So you have an entire generation now of younger Ukrainian officers, right, that fight the way the West does, right, what we call mission command in the United States, but lower level, right, individual leader initiative, right, at that low level, as opposed to kind of the old Soviet system of, right, everything goes up to the brigade or division commander. You just go out and do your operation. That's all you understand, right? And when things don't go according to plan, you can't improvise and innovate on your own. And so that's a second change, right? So their army has this, right, lower level leadership that can operate that way. And then the third piece, right, is Western aid, right? Whether it's the advisors we talked about before with training or, right, providing them critical weaponry, right? Again, going back to 2014, when Russians sent their T-90 tanks across the border with the reactive armor, Ukrainians really didn't have anything. They were more or less impenetrable to what they had. So giving them, these state-of-the-art anti-tank weapon systems, right, improves their capability. And so we're seeing all this play out. And in some ways, right, just look at, again, the most recent Nagorno-Karabakh war, right? Azerbaijan making smart investment in its military to be effective and reclaim its own territory, right? And that's what Ukraine has done, right? Smart investment. It's not that it's significantly increased its defense spending. It's just been much smarter about how it does it, right? And investing in those right capabilities, making those critical reforms. And we've seen that play out on the battlefield. Yeah, in terms of Russian capabilities, yes, Russia's military is going to be much larger, right? It's got a much more better air force, better air defense system, right? Rockets, missiles that it can use, right? And we're seeing those things play out. And so those standoff weapons, Russia's going to perform better, but ultimately to make advances and to accomplish their strategic objective, it requires, right, troops at the low level in that tactical fight. And at that tactical fight, that's where the Ukrainians are going to outperform and continue to outperform them. In terms of, right, if this plays out longer, right, these volunteers that they're supporting, right, you just got to look at history of war in urban environment, right? It's bitter, it's difficult. Arguably, there's no tougher terrain to fight in because, right, you can hide anywhere. And so, right, you don't have to organize a volunteer as, right, think of it as as an organized platoons with companies and battalions. It's more of an insurgency that they're fighting in that mix, right? As the Russians come in. And so, right, an individual armed with or a small team can really harass or really the Russian, anything that they're trying to do in Kharkiv in the east or in Kyiv and at the capital. And so that's what they're trying to do. And I think they're being pretty effective with it. And again, it's early in the conflict, as everybody said. It remains to see how this plays out. But it will move to another state, the next stage where it's going to be this brutal urban combat. And in those, right, I think those volunteers, people with less experience, can still be pretty effective, as we've seen historically in war, right, throughout the years. You don't need necessarily that training to have an effect, but you still need, right, the Ukrainian army to really take them out.
So, Professor Freilich, we've heard about just one moment. Alan, just so you know, you're visible on screen. Professor Freilich, we've heard about conventional forces and conventional engagements just now from Colonel Collins. One thing that's shown its face here is the role of cyber attacks and cyber capabilities. Tell us a bit about that as an emerging domain of war, please, if you would.
Well, first of all, I think the most impressive part of the cyber dimension of this conflict so far is that it has been very, very minimal. It has been far less than anyone expected. If you look at what the Russians did in Ukraine and then Crimea starting in 2014, so far they haven't even done anything like that. And the expectations were that this initiative, the invasion, at least especially the early stages, would be accompanied by massive cyber attacks to even largely shut down the Ukrainian civil arena, and of course to try and do as much as possible to defang their military capabilities. We haven't seen it. There have only been a few attacks and no major ones. So this is actually a big surprise, and the Russians are one of the top 3 cyber players in the world, and they're the ones who've been most aggressive to date militarily. So why is this the case? I don't know. I would imagine that it is still to come. Cyber in general is the new frontier, or certainly one of them. And one of the questions that Ukraine may end up being a proving ground for this: can you basically shut down a country by cyber means? Now, what happens, for example, if they turn off just the traffic lights in the big cities when they go into Kiev? imagine the traffic snarls. Well, certainly if this was in peacetime, it would be, the whole city would be shut down. If they shut down electricity, then the whole country comes to a halt. Since the cities are empty, the traffic thing isn't as critical. In Israel's case, for example, if they shut down just traffic lights when a crisis emerges, the forces can't reach the front on time. That could be critical. In any event, we haven't yet seen an all-out cyber war. People were looking at Ukraine as what could have been the precedent for that. I'd like to say one, because I'm in a few minutes at least, I will be getting off. I'd like to say,
I'm watching the clock for you, Professor.
Something about the diplomatic dance that Israel's involved in. And I see a lot of calls from really wise people who want Israel to take an unequivocal moral stance here. And I sympathize with them on an emotional level. Of course, it would be very, very nice to do that. And there's no doubt that whose side Israel is on here. We're with the West, and we're, of course, with the United States. And in this case, we're with the people of Ukraine. Morality is also important in its own right. And it's important in the end because our national security is founded in the final analysis in a moral argument. But at the same time, national leaders have to, and I'm sure that Mr. Bennett and Lapid want to say exactly what I'm sure all of us think about what Mr. Putin has done. They'd love to come out and say it. But national leaders have to balance the moral dimension, their emotions, with concrete needs. And I described in the beginning the kind of threat that we face from Hezbollah and we may face from the Iranians if they manage to set up their own capabilities in a big way in Syria and entrench Hezbollah there in a big way. The people who take the moral position will be very satisfied today. What happens when the fighting breaks out and thousands of rockets, maybe up to 2,000 a day, but tens of thousands are raining down on Israel over the course of weeks, if and when the next big round of Hezbollah breaks out? What are they going to say then when we have mass casualties? What are they going to say, even if things don't go anywhere near that far? Let's say there's just a small round and the Russians either turn on the S-300 that's in Syrian hands, or they use their own S-400, and the first Israeli F-35 or F-15 is shot down. Are they going to go and visit the pilot's family? Talk to the wife and the orphans? Talk to the parents? So there is a need here to balance things. And I must say that I give the government a lot of credit. I think Mr. Bennett and Mr. Lapid have walked the tightrope here quite effectively so far. And all of that has to be then qualified with what some of the other speakers have said. Well, we're in very early days. We'll see how this whole thing plays out. My presumption is that Israel will have really no choice but to do what it would like to do. Sooner or later, we're going to have to come out and take the unequivocal position. We're not there yet.
Professor Freilich, I'm going to thank you for your time. Before I ask you, Ambassador Munter, to come back, it looks like do you have just a... Yes.
I just wanted to say to Professor Freilich, I absolutely agree with you. And I think, and I hope, that the leaders of this particular government in America truly understand that and don't want to force Israel to do this when it's not crucial. As you say, as events may bring us, it may become crucial to make some commitment or another, but we're not there yet. And so there's no need.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think Secretary Blinken has demonstrated quite clearly that he understands this. And I can also say, with all due respect to ourselves, we sometimes forget in the final analysis, Israel is a small regional actor. We do not have to be at the forefront of every international issue. Sometimes being quiet is a virtue, something that we could also learn to do better on other occasions.
Professor, thank you so much for your time. Everyone else is staying on, and I've got plenty of follow-up questions. I'm sorry I don't have the opportunity on this occasion due to your schedule to have a back and forth with you on the points you just raised, but I very much appreciate your time and thank you for educating us. And I look forward to many future conversations. I'm sorry this one takes place under such dire circumstances, but thank you very much for giving of your time. And
thank you.
To you, Ambassador Munter, I want to ask the following question. The reality is that right now, coming back to Ukraine, we've heard Vladimir Putin was warned repeatedly against invading. He did so anyway. Now, over 520,000 Ukrainians have fled to neighboring countries, and up to 4 million refugees could follow in the coming months, according to UN estimates. What's the response to that influx of refugees likely to be from surrounding countries? Do we have their full cooperation? There's a lot of controversy about this issue, for example, in the United Kingdom. And sanctions notwithstanding, does this speak to the fact that we are about to watch a return, with some changes, to the Cold War, with the Berlin Wall now being rebuilt, albeit in Ukraine, right in the heart of Kiev? Is that what we're looking at?
Well, let's tackle the first question about refugees. There's a palpable difference between the way people who are, to put it crudely, from the Slavic world feel, and people who are from, let's call it, core Europe feel. I am talking to you from Prague in the Czech Republic. I have a country house where there is a Ukrainian guy who, until a few days ago, used to work on my house, and he has now gotten in his car and gone off, as he put it, to kill Russians, right? So we're used to these people. We know these people, and they speak a language that's intelligible to us. And there's a cultural affinity, if you will, that I think will allow for enormous absorption capacity of refugees. I'm sorry to say that, this leads to another kind of question for another day about whether there is a question about racism. Can you accept people who are brown and Muslim? Maybe not, but you can accept people who are Christian and white. Okay, let's leave that for a different day. But the fact is, these people who are coming into Poland, Romania, Slovakia, people are driving to the border to pick them up and take them to the States. I think there's an enormous enthusiasm to take these people in. So I don't think that is going to trigger the kind of crisis that you had, for example, with Afghanistan or with North Africa. Okay, so that's one problem that is maybe longer term, but at least immediately not an issue. The other question is there going to be kind of a new Berlin Wall through the middle of Kiev? We don't know the Russian tactics. We don't know whether the point here is to decapitate and, as they put, denazify the country. Huge irony when you have a Jewish president, but but the point here is, if what they mean to do is to actually occupy that part of the country that's east of the Dnieper River, then what you have is a division of Ukraine. Then what you have is a running sore between the two countries. And your analogy may be correct, that you have basically a new Cold War line that is basically runs down the middle of Ukraine, where people in the West are being given support and javelins and rifles from the West, and people in the East have the kind of sitting in the smoldering ruins are part of a terrible situation, but a tense new line in Europe. That's possible, but what we don't know what their military goals are. We don't know are they going to send troops all the way to Lviv? Are they not going to send any troops in? Are they going to say, we're going to smash Kiev and then we're just going to claim the part to the east? We don't know that. I'm not even sure they know that. And so that question of where the line will be, what the line will look like, and especially if you use the analogy of the Warsaw Uprising, and I mean of 44, the Warsaw Uprising, if the people throwing Molotov cocktails out of the windows succeed in smashing the Russians and killing themselves at the same time, you've got this enormous humanitarian mess. And I don't even know what Putin does with that after it's done. And I think this is a real possibility, that they could go in and treat this like Grozny, but a lot of Russians would die in the process. And so we can't answer your second question, that is, where is that line going to be and what does it look like, until we see what they're going to do with Kiev, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Munter. Let me ask you a question, Liam. I'm reading reports about the Ukrainian success, and then Ambassador Koll, I'm going to come back to you about a couple of points with regard to Israel's diplomatic positioning. We're reading reports about Ukrainian success in stymieing Russia's advance. The Russians, for example, have not launched an all-out raid on Kiev. Just as one example, it was expected to have happened by now, according to some assessments. It has not happened yet. While some celebrate, I'm deeply concerned that that is merely a precursor to a massive unleashing of far more lethal techniques, far more lethal munitions against these cities, and we are just going to see the Russian invasion intensify, massively so, perhaps along the lines of that which we saw in Syria. What are your thoughts? Do you think that the Ukrainians are indeed managing to stand fast? Do you think that they're standing fast, awaiting an even more intense onslaught from the Russians?
Yeah, I think, right, this is kind of a normal tactical pause, is what you would call it in the military, as they move on to the capital, right? I don't know how detailed their battle plan was, but it's almost like now they're moving the positions up, right? Moving these massive number of forces so they can figure out their plan. Are they going to lay a siege to it? Are they going to surround it, right? Are they going to go in and try to take it over, whatever that means? And so I think that's why there's this natural pause. So yes, they've held them off for now, but I think they're waiting for a larger attack. And then when they do go to that, again, it's just the next stage of the war, and you're going to see that brutal urban fighting that we've seen in historical conflicts. And I would expect it to be more, like Ambassador said, more like a Grozny, because historically Russian has not really cared about collateral damage or what destruction it leaves behind it, right? The West is focused on precision guided munitions, right? And we use these in Iraq fairly effectively to, right, still significant damage in Fallujah and other types of cities like that, but greatly reduced from what you would do if you were just shooting, large number of rockets into a city. And so I would expect it will get more like that. It will get to a more brutal phase, as if that's what Russia wants to do.
So this pause prior to moving on to the capital, in the event that it does, this is not a testament to a successful holding off of the forces by Ukraine. You say this is just a standard tactical pause. Is that how you'd advise people to look at it?
No, I mean, clearly the Ukrainians have pushed some advances back, right? So it's not that they just got there and stopped. No, that's kind of where maybe the supplies have kind of exhausted. Maybe they try to develop the plan. The Ukrainians have been successful stopping them at that point. I think had the Ukrainians not been successful, then they would have probably rolled into the capital and tried to do something. But the their defenses kept them out, right? Just like it had kept them out of Kharkiv for the most part, or, forces that got into Kharkiv, right? Then reports of the Ukrainians counterattacking and pushing them back out a couple of days ago. So that's kind of what it is. So it's not, from the onset, it wasn't necessarily, I don't believe, a designed pause by the Russians. It's just kind of normal flow of the battle.
Thank you very much, Colonel. So, Ambassador Koll, I would like to take a different approach to Israel's diplomatic response to this situation. I will say that I'm disappointed by the diplomatic response. It's not to say that I don't agree with Ambassador Munter's statements and his hope that the international community and the Americans understand Israel's complexities. I also understand Israel's complexities. But I want Israel to be unequivocally, publicly, on the side of moral clarity and righteousness, as it calls the international community to do when we are rocketed in a far less existential manner, certainly a severe manner, but a far less existential manner, for example, by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. I want the state of Israel to say that it has the strength and the ability not only to overtly, repeatedly condemn what Russia is doing in Ukraine, but also to express that it will enforce its red lines nonetheless, those red lines being the refusal to accept the smuggling of contraband through Syria, for example, to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. I would like to see the state of Israel be far more strident in its statements. And I'm concerned that Israel's, what could be perceived as being Israel's equivocation on this, due to the complexities that I think Professor Freilich and Ambassador Munter and you have correctly pointed out, I'm afraid and concerned that that will not age well, and history will not remember well the fact that Israel equivocated here. Tell me why I'm wrong, tell me where I'm correct, tell me if that's something that we might want but cannot be. What are your thoughts, given your decades of service in the foreign ministry? Sometimes
governments conducting their actions in ways which seem to be taking into consideration complicated matters, conflicting matters, conflicting interests, and they have to put all into one basket. And the outcome may not be very popular with some people. And what you say is that condemning 3 days ago the invasion and voting in the General Assembly condemning the invasion as well, which is expected, I think, tomorrow or whenever the vote is going to be, sending 100 tons of humanitarian aid, which is on its way now to Poland and going to be pushed into the Ukraine. That is not enough. Setting up Dorit Nitzan, I think Ambassador Munter knows Dorit Nitzan, who used to be the head of WHO first in Belgrade, later all of Europe, retired last week. And although she came to Israel, back to Israel last week, she in 2 days flies to Poland to establish a whole network of medical aid for much needed Ukrainians. All of that, you say, is not enough. So it seems to be that what you would like to see as the Israeli commandos with knives between the thieves going and fighting the war. And as President Biden said, American troops are not going to fight on the land of Ukraine. And I assume that maybe there are some Americans who are disappointed, or some Europeans, but I think that is the right statement. It is the right statement for the government of Israel to condemn, as we do, the invasion, but not act in a way which will damage our basic needs and all what has been described before vis-a-vis Russia. Now, will that satisfy you? I don't know, but Israel has to act in ways which will not necessarily satisfy everyone. And with your permission, I want to say something which is important. We talked about diplomacy, but I want to say a word about public diplomacy and public opinion.
Please.
Because basically what you say is something which comes from public and public opinion. I think that this last week or so is remarkable and will be studied when it comes to the effect of public opinion and public diplomacy. To a very large extent, at least in my view, the speed at which President Biden and Secretary Blinken and the European Union and everyone united in a unity of action and was to a large extent due to public opinion. Because if you remember, the first 2 days, the sanctions declared were quite weak. And it was because of public pressure, that scenes that were coming out from Kiev, from the other hotspots in the Ukraine, and the media coverage of it. And I saw a poll on CNN I think 2 or 3 days ago, that 70% of American public would like to see a much stronger action from the part of the United Nations, much stronger sanctions against Russia. So from very weak sanctions the first 2 days, what we see today is very biting sanctions. And the other thing is President Zelensky. You know, the weeks and months before this crisis, he was described as this ex-comedian who, when in times of crisis, how will he act? And he turns out to be a master of using his ability to connect with the West in speeches and other forms, and drawing a lot of sympathy and effect on public opinion in the West, which affect the leaders. And last but not least, people seem to believe that Putin, or Russia, gives no regard to public opinion. And to a large extent, that is true, of course, it's a totalitarian regime. But let us not commit any mistake. There is public opinion in Russia. And one of the things that we should follow very closely is these arrests, which by now come to thousands of people in Russia who demonstrate against the invasion and are quietened and put behind bars very, very quickly. But if the numbers grow, if the number of dead going back in bags to Russia is going to grow, public opinion in Russia may be an important factor on how things evolve as well. So diplomacy and talks behind closed doors is important, and you know, mega strategic considerations, but public opinion is playing a key role both in the West and definitely may play a significant role in Russia as well.
So I'm going to wrap up with going round the horn with some quick fire questions. But before I do, Ambassador Koll, I just want to be clear. My disappointment has nothing to do, nor was my question phrased as such, nothing to do with the dispatch of Israeli commandos with knives between their teeth. That's not something that I call on us to do. And it certainly is not me saying that what we have done is insufficient. What it is saying, however, is I would like to see a more rapid diplomatic condemnation of what we're seeing in Russia. And I'm actually still of that opinion, but certainly I agree with you on the notion of not dispatching troops or flying over Ukraine or anything of that sort. So let's go around it with one final question for each of you. Colonel Collins, does President Zelensky survive this conflict?
I don't have a crystal ball, so but given where we're at today, I would say yes. I mean, again, it's going to be a long, brutal fight potentially. But I think what Russia views as their strategic goal right now, it's hard to know for sure. It really is replacing Zelensky with a favorable regime and establishing a satellite there, which will be short-lived because of the internal resistance that will continue. But you know, maybe I'm optimistic, but I think he'll survive this. That they're, you know, as long as the West and others stay committed to supporting him in the ways that we can, then I think he will survive this, and Ukrainians will hold out. They're fighting for the defense of their nation, and the Russian invaders don't really understand the purpose of what they're doing.
Yeah, just a very quick follow-up. Does he survive this in Ukraine or in exile?
Oh, in Ukraine. He's not leaving. He already said he doesn't need a ride. He needs help.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Munter, does Vladimir Putin survive this, given what Ambassador Koll said about Russian public opinion and its existence and the sanctions and the impact that's going to have, and what some have said is certainly a troubled military operation? Does Vladimir Putin emerge from this unscathed? Does he survive this?
Well, as they say, in the long run, we're all dead, including Vladimir Putin. I don't know. I would not predict that this is an immediate problem that will make him fall. I am not sanguine that what we expect is that a bunch of oligarchs are going to say, they're taking away my yacht, they're taking away my London football team, we're going to have a coup and we're going to throw him out like Khrushchev. I don't look for that anytime soon. I think that this system has been built over 20 years. This is not, we make fun of it as a rickety system. I don't think it's quite as rickety as some people would say. So he's going to stay in power for a while. The question is whether he is capable of making adjustments. He may surprise us that he's capable of actually assessing what happens. There's kind of a myth about him that he's in his own bubble and he doesn't see things. I think that is a little bit premature. We have to see whether he and those people he trusts are able to make an assessment and say, we have to adjust. So I think at least in the short run, he survives. The question is what he survives with and how he survives. And we simply don't know that. Let me add as a final comment to what you said, Ben, the question of, the moral stance of Israel. Make no mistake, at least from the United States point of view, we'll come after you at the right point. The question is when. And it may be that right now it's not necessary, or it's not the most effective thing Israel can do to take a moral stance. But there may be things Israel can do in the future that Israel is very good at, that we need not mention, that might be very useful, and that will be the contribution that Israel makes. That even today may seem that Israel is not taking as much of a moral stance, but Israel may actually have a quite heroic role to play in the future quietly.
Thank you, Ambassador Munter. And I've asked Colonel Collins and Ambassador Munter to look somewhat into the future. Ambassador Koll, I'm going to ask you to give a response to something that relates to the past. And I ask you this because I know something of your attachment to this subject. I've spoken informally to many, many Israelis, and I've spoken informally to American Jews whose parents fled the Holocaust and who remember well facts such as 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews perishing in the Holocaust and 34,000 Jews having been killed in the first 2 days of the Babin massacre, for example. And within those voices, some express that they care not at all. So the very opposite of what I'm expressing, that they care not a jot about what happens to Ukraine today. The memory of the Holocaust within their family looms large and informs their worldview to this day. What's the response to individuals who express opinions such as that?
Look, when it comes to the Holocaust, emotions run high. And since the area of conflict these days in the very heart of where things happened in the middle of the 20th century, just before and I don't know if you followed the news, but the Ukrainians came out with a press release today, I think, that the monument in Babi Yar was damaged during I think today or yesterday's moves of fighting.
I didn't see that. Thank you for that.
Yes, and if that is not enough, the Ukrainian ambassador in Israel today expressing his view that he wants more of Israel. He asked for some non-lethal military equipment, and to justify that, he said that during the Holocaust, the Ukrainians saved thousands of Jews, and therefore they deserve these non-lethal weapons. And to the contrary, you mentioned that some Israelis remember some Ukrainians who acted in a very opposite way. I don't think it will do any good from policy point of view to delve into these matters. I understand individual Israelis or Jews thinking one way or another. I do hope that policymakers are capable of, on the one hand, express their moral view about what is happening in Ukraine and condemn the invasion and say it very clearly, but at the same time, remember always what are the basic interests of the country at any given time. And I totally share the view that there may be the day that is coming, it may be soon, it may be a little bit later, that Israel will have to be much more clear in its words and in its actions than it is today. I can assure you, not sitting in the corridors of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs today, but knowing how it operates every single day. There is a group of people around the foreign minister who is discussing this matter. What is right for today? I don't know whether that is what is right today will be right in 2 days' time or 2 weeks' time. It will be determined to a very large extent on what is happening on the ground, and we don't know what is going to be to happen on the ground. I'm a little bit pessimistic when it comes to the scenes that are going to come out very soon from the big major cities in the Ukraine. The Ukrainians are brave and are fighting in a very effective way, but let's not forget the Russians have only marginally touched their firing power and the overall military strength. And once they decide to go ahead and use it, the scenes are going to be terrible. And once those scenes are going to be terrible, the whole world will have to respond, including Israel.
Ambassador Koll, thank you very much. I want to bring this to a close. This is the conclusion of today's webinar entitled Russia Invades Ukraine, US and Israeli Security and Diplomatic Implications. It leaves me only to thank, first and foremost, Rosita Prini, co-founder of the MirYam Institute. Thank you, Rosita. Also, our colleague in common, Alan Langer. Thank you for coordinating and even coming on screen, Alan, very briefly in the middle of that. That was a highlight for me. And I also want to thank, of course, our listeners and our viewers, whether they're listening live or via a postcast, podcast, or on JBS TV. We appreciate each and every one of you. And of course, thank you so very much to our interviewees. In his absence, Professor Chuck Freilich, former Deputy National Security Advisor for the State of Israel, Ambassador Cameron Munter, Colonel Liam Collins, and Ambassador Arthur Koll. Thank you, each of you, for enriching us with your knowledge and for continuing my personal education. And may we see peace over the skies of Ukraine in the very near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Rosita, and the MirYam Institute. And of course, for my colleagues, it was a great opportunity to talk about very sad issues.
Thank you.
Thank you, Artur. Good to see you.
Thanks.